Okay, chapter 7. We've already talked about ancient Egyptians, and they were probably the most substantial ancient civilization in Africa, but there were lots of smaller groups that need mentioning as well, and that's what chapter 7 is about. All right, so the first part is just about basic geography, and I'm going to zip through this because we have done this already, so you already know most of this, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't take the notes and know this information again for this test. All right, the land of Africa, of course, Africa is the second largest continent after Asia. It's about 5,000 miles north to south, and it's almost completely surrounded by water. You have the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea, and it is connected to Asia along the Sinai Peninsula up here by Egypt. But of course, now the man-made division of the Suez Canal has completely separated it. All right, the geography regions. There are distinct regions in Africa. In the north, it's along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. There are mountains, like we've already mentioned before, the Atlas Mountains. The Sahara, of course, the largest desert in the world, and in Africa is also in the northern region. The western portion is called the Hump of Africa. It jets out into the Atlantic Ocean. It has lots of grasslands all the way up to thick tropical jungles. The eastern portion has mountains, or maybe not as significant as other continents, but highlands and plateaus more than maybe mountains. Lots of lakes, you can see that, and we identified those earlier before. The Great Rift Valley is this whole section, and you can see that all the way down the eastern coast. It has some mountains that overlook deep canyons. It also has lots of grasslands that encourage larger populations of wild animals. In the south, you have the Congo River Basin, which is in the center of Africa along the rainforest, which of course is along the equator. You have some hills and plateaus as well. A plateau is a relatively high, flat piece of land. Think of it as a mountain that is cut off the top, so it's not coming up to a peak. It's elevated, but it's flat, and it's relatively dry as well. And there are some deserts in the south as well, the Kalahari and the Namibia Desert. All right, climate zones are related to those zones that I just talked about. So there are 4 in Africa, and again, we've mentioned these before. The mild zones are in the northern portion and the southern tip. They get moderate rain and warmer temperatures. This is a great place for farming because it has a lot of fertile land. So again, the darker green regions to the north and to the south. The deserts, the major deserts in the north are the Sahara in the north and the Kalahari in the south. And actually, deserts encompass 40% of Africa's total land. So you can see the large desert in the north, and it even extends over to the Horn of Africa, and then the Kalahari Desert in the south. The rainforest runs along the equator because you get heavy rains and warm to hot temperatures, dense, thick forests, which makes it much more difficult to farm and also to travel. So the people here are isolated a bit more. Obviously, because of this yearly warm, rainy area, there's lots of diseases, and mostly they're carried by insects like the tsetse fly, which infects humans and both animals and humans with a sleeping sickness. So that means in this area, they do not raise cattle, and they don't use animals as beasts of burden within farming, even if they do farm, because it can carry this disease. So again, those are the 4 major regions, and you can see the light tan area is the desert, the mild is the darker green, the rainforest is the light green, and the savanna is the peach colored areas. Savannas are, again, 40% of Africa's land. So between deserts and savannas, that's most of Africa. A savanna is a broad grassland that has smaller trees and shrubs. It doesn't have enough rain to substantiate a rainforest. It's in the northern and southern parts of Africa. They get a lot of rain, or at least enough rain, but it's very unpredictable and unreliable. So farming and herding are very common in this area. And again, so you can see those are the peach shaded regions of Africa. All right, so one of the first civilizations besides Egypt was the Koosh. And the Koosh was actually controlled by Egypt for a while, and they lived in the region of Nubia. Nubia was south of Egypt along the Nile River as well. And by 2000 BC, it was considered to be a very prominent trade route. And so they traded ebony, ivory, frankincense, and even unique things like leopard skins. By 1000 BC, they were freed from Egypt, and then they turned around a few hundred years later and conquered Egypt in 750 BC. And even though they were still using bronze and stone weapons, they were able to conquer Egypt because Egypt was declining in their power as they once had, as we read in chapter 2. So, Nubia, you can see, is along the Nile River. And Egypt, of course, we mentioned before as a powerhouse earlier, and it is in that same region that was just further south from ancient Egypt. All right, in 633 BC, a group of the Assyrians, which were from the modern-day area of Syria, took over Egypt, and they did this because they had stronger weapons using iron weapons. And because of that, the Koosh, still using their bronze and stone tools, didn't have quite the strength in their army, and they retreated back to Nubia. And again, then they established their kingdom here as well. They originally started out as a farming economy. Then, because they were where they were located, they became a major trading state. All right, Moreau was one of the major trading locations in this ancient area, and again, it was along the Nile River. They had lots of iron ore deposits, and they learned smelting from the Assyrians who took over Egypt and were already able to make iron weapons. They exported iron products, ivory, gold, ebony, and yes, humans as slaves. So they became this major trading empire along the western, central, and eastern parts of Africa. They even traded in the Mediterranean area of the Roman Empire, Arabia, which was to the east, and India, which was much further east. What did they get from most of those areas? They traded their iron, ivory, gold, ebony, and slaves for jewelry and silver lamps, specifically from India and Arabia. Moreau was very urban-like, very modern city, so it wasn't very rural or farm-like. They had a large, prosperous merchant class because of trading, and the Koosh declined because of a new group of people, the Aksum. So Moreau, you can see, is located right along the Nile River, south of the 5 cataracts or rapids along the Nile River. All right, the rise of the Aksum. You can see here that this was a major location between the Roman Empire and India. That's why it made it to be such a major trading empire. And because of that, it combined the Arab world and the African cultures. And since it was just across the Red Sea, it made it ideal for trading. So they exported ivory, frankincense, myrrh, and slaves. They brought in textiles, mostly cotton from India, metal goods, wine, and even olive oil. So the Aksum competed with the Koosh kingdom for the ivory trade along here. And in the 4th century, King Ezana invaded and conquered the Koosh. And the unique thing that King Ezana did was that he converted to Christianity, which wasn't common. So he was an Ethiopian king that was one of the first Christian leaders or kings, and after his death, Christianity was kind of in conflict with a new religion that was starting to dominate this area, Islam. So Islam, of course, developed on the Arabian Peninsula in Mecca, and the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula controlled Egypt in 640 AD. In the 8th century, northern Africa was completely under Arab rule, which spread the Islamic faith, and they did that because of the major trading states along the Red Sea. And again, many trading locations along there. In the 12th century, they gained more land inward in Africa so they could get more ivory and more slaves. And in the 5th century, there was a lot of conflict between the Aksum and the Arabs. All right, so now you're going to use your notes and do the Canvas review questions over 7-1 and submit those.